There's a recurring pattern in world history that has taken down three global superpowers over the last 500 years. And in 2025, the United States is moving through that same sequence step by step, choice by choice, as if we were following a script that ended in disaster every prior time. In 1590, Spain stood as the richest empire on Earth. It controlled roughly half of the world's gold and silver. Its armies dominated Europe. Its money circulated everywhere. Within 80 years, it was bankrupt, a second-tier state that never returned to the top. In 1914, Britain governed the largest empire the world had ever seen. The sun never set on British holdings, and sterling served as the reserve currency of global commerce. Within 40 years, the empire was gone, the currency had fallen, and Britain became the junior partner to the United States. In 1991, the Soviet Union was the other pole of power nuclear weapons. Global reach, satellites stretched around the world, and it disappeared in about 900 days. Not from invasion, but from economic implosion. 3 times, 3 great powers, 3 full collapses, each following the same chain of events. And here's the part that should unsettle you. The United States has already advanced through 5 of the 7 links in that chain. We're not just approaching the template, we're operating inside it. This is how empires end, why they always insist their situation is unique, and why the arithmetic points to us as the next example. It is unfolding faster than most are willing to say aloud. Before walking through the sequence, it's important to picture what imperial failure looks like in practice, not just in textbooks. When a superpower dies, the beginning is rarely an enemy landing troops or a decisive battlefield defeat. It starts with exhaustion in the economic core. The sphere of commitment stretches past what can actually be carried. Bases scattered across roughly 150 countries, simultaneous conflicts to manage, pledges that exceed capacity, liabilities that cannot be serviced. At first, the downward slope is hidden. The currency still clears transactions. The armed forces still win engagements. The state still issues assurances. But underneath, the framework is cracking. Resources get misdirected. Real productive strength shrinks. Talented people leave. Then the slide speeds up. Partners hedge their bets. Adversaries push lines. Trading relationships hunt for substitutes. The prestige of the reserve currency fades. The very advantages that made you powerful turn into vulnerabilities. The money that the world once had to hold comes roaring back home. A far-flung military posture becomes impossible to finance. Promises once backed by strength start sounding hollow. That is not a hypothetical. It is exactly what happened to Spain, to Britain, and to the Soviet Union. They assumed their power would last. They went beyond their means. They debased their money. They refused to adjust until the break was already in motion. Here is how it happened 3 times, in the same order. Begin with Spain in the 1500s and 1600s, the original model. After Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, Spain became the first true world power. The crown subdued the Aztec and Inca empires and took control of the richest veins of gold and silver ever found. By the middle of the 16th century, Spanish galleons were bringing home around 200 tons of silver a year. By 1600, over 400 tons annually. Spain effectively controlled Europe's monetary base. The Spanish real acted as the world's default money. Everyone sought Spanish silver, and from that position came the fatal assumption that monetary dominance made the empire untouchable. Philip VI, who ruled from 1556 to 1598, commanded more cash than any monarch in history to that point, and he directed it toward holding and expanding a global domain. The first step down was fighting everywhere at once. Spain engaged the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, waged campaigns against France and in Italy, tried to stamp out Protestant rebellion in the Netherlands, contested sea power with England, pushed conflicts in the Philippines, and fought across the Americas. By 1580, Madrid was committed on 4 continents. The bill devoured revenue roughly half the state's intake, went to the military, and still it failed to cover the needs. The next turn was monetary. Taxes could not finance the reach, so the crown did what failing powers repeatedly do. It lowered the quality of the coinage. Copper was mixed into coins that were meant to be silver. What should have been pure became half copper, then 3/4 copper. The stamped value didn't change, but the substance did. By 1600, coins labeled as silver contained almost none. Merchants stopped honoring face values. Prices surged. Borrowing followed. Spain took loans from Italian houses, from German banks, from anyone prepared to lend. In 1557, less than 2 decades into Philip's reign, the crown defaulted. It renegotiated and returned to the market. Another default came in 1560, another in 1575, another in 1596. 4 times in 40 years. Each episode carried promises to reform. Each was followed by the same behavior. Then production withered. The part most people miss about Spain's decline is that the avalanche of bullion helped wreck the productive base. When money is easy, making things looks optional. Why plant and harvest if imports are simple to buy? Why build ships at home if foreign yards will sell them? Why invent when you can spend? The elite treated work as beneath them. Manufacturing faded, farming stalled. Cash raced abroad to pay for foreign goods. French wine, Italian silk, Dutch manufactures. Silver poured in and poured right back out. Spain became a pass-through rather than a producer. When New World mining output declined, the entire arrangement failed. Social breakdown took root. With the economy failing, crime rose. Beggars multiplied in Madrid. People who made and built things left. The most capable minds moved to places that were creating France, England, the Netherlands. Spain was left heavy with officials, soldiers, and clergy consumers of wealth rather than creators. By 1640, Portugal was gone. By mid-century, the Netherlands, its richest holding, had slipped away. By 1700, the once mighty empire was a shell, large on maps, but hollowed out. In less than a century, Spain fell from global supremacy to secondary status and never returned. Today it is a regional European state, pleasant, cultured, but not decisive in world affairs. That is the concrete picture of imperial failure. Now move 3 centuries ahead to Britain in the 1900s, the empire on which the sun never set. At peak, London governed roughly a quarter of the world's land and some 400 million subjects. Sterling served as the world's reserve unit. Major trade contracts were priced in pounds. Central banks held British paper. London was the planet's financial capital, and just as Spain once had, Britain assumed the arrangement was permanent even as it slid into the same track. By 1900, British forces were spread across the map: India, Africa, the Middle East, China, the Pacific, the Caribbean. Defense stretched across 6 continents. The expense was enormous. When war erupted in 1914, Britain faced a choice: sit out and watch the continent bleed, or enter and risk bankrupting the imperial system to prevail. It chose to fight. The First World War cost Britain more than $40 billion, about $1 trillion in current terms. It borrowed heavily, primarily from the United States. By the armistice, Britain owed Washington billions. The former creditor had become a debtor, but the war was won and the empire survived. The expectation was recovery. That expectation was wrong. Monetary strain came next. Sterling was nominally anchored to gold, but the war had drained the reserves. Gold had crossed the Atlantic to pay for food, munitions, and other essentials. By 1920, the stock of bullion had fallen to roughly half its 1914 level. Still, in 1925, Britain restored the pre-war parity. The effect was to make the pound too strong, pricing British goods out of world markets. Manufacturing slipped. Unemployment rose. Interest rates had to be kept high to defend the currency, strangling domestic activity. In 1931, the defense failed. Britain abandoned the gold standard, and sterling fell by roughly a quarter overnight. The reserve currency had openly conceded it could not keep its promise. Debt pressure did not abate, and another world war arrived. The Second World War added around $120 billion in cost and required even more borrowing from America. By 1945, Britain owed the United States and Canada more than $30 billion, more than the country's entire annual output. The war was won, but the imperial structure was finished. It could not be funded or defended. The holdings unraveled. In 1947, Britain gave up India, the crown jewel that had served as a pillar of wealth for 2 centuries. Over the next 20 years, the rest followed: Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean. By 1970, the empire existed primarily as a lesson in history. The money kept weakening. In 1940, £1 exchanged for roughly $4.03. By 1950, it was $2.80. By 1970, about $2.40. By 1980, around $2.30. Today it buys far less. The currency that once anchored global reserves became regional in scope. Britain tried to keep the badge of status, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, nuclear arms, a special relationship with Washington. But it was window dressing for a reality everyone understood. The era had ended and did not return. Now, look at the most recent case, the Soviet Union from 1945 to 1991. After the Second World War, the USSR emerged with nuclear arms, a massive military, dominance over Eastern Europe, and a presence in space. The leadership believed the future belonged to them, that communism would outlast capitalism, and their model would dominate. For 45 years, they raced the United States in hardware and reach, building more tanks, more missiles, more troops. Beneath that show of strength, the economy was failing. The military burden was crushing on, the order of 15 to 20% of GDP, roughly triple the American share. Moscow felt compelled to match U.S. technology, alliances, and deployments, even though its economy was much smaller. It bled resources in Afghanistan and sent money and equipment to hold clients from Cuba and Syria to Vietnam, North Korea, Angola, and Ethiopia. The outlays could not be maintained. Growth stalled in the 1970s. Oil revenue kept the state afloat, but the rest of the system broke down. Factories turned out inferior products. Farms failed to meet needs. Technology trailed by decades. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was importing grain despite its immense farmland. Central planning smothered adaptation. Incentive was missing. Productivity suffered when no one benefited from doing more. The currency was never real money beyond Soviet borders. The ruble was not freely exchangeable. Citizens favored dollars whenever they could get them. To buy foreign goods, the government needed gold or oil because nobody wanted rubles. By 1985, oil prices weakened and gold stocks ran thin. They were running out of money that other countries would accept. Then, the outer ring fell away. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. Eastern Europe left, in a single year. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and East Germany slipped free. The buffer that gave Moscow depth disappeared. The state could not stop it. It was broke. The end was sudden. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. From the fall of the wall to dissolution took roughly 900 days. There was no invading army. The state simply imploded economically. Soldiers went unpaid. Government functions stalled. The ruble became essentially worthless. A superpower with roughly 30,000 nuclear warheads collapsed because its economic system gave way. The sequence repeated: overreach, monetary failure, debt pressure, loss of the periphery, collapse. Here is the part that should keep Americans awake. The United States is tracing the same line, step by step. The country maintains more than 750 military facilities in about 80 countries, and U.S. forces have a presence in roughly 150. We are committed to European defense through NATO, to the security of Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, to operations in the Middle East, to countering China and Russia. Annual defense outlays run around $850 billion, more than the next 10 countries combined, and the strain is still obvious. Equipment ages, recruiting lags, and the list of obligations exceeds what can be fulfilled. If China moved on Taiwan, if Russia pressed into NATO territory, if Iran shut the Persian Gulf, the United States could not address all fronts at once. That is the same overextension Spain, Britain, and the USSR faced. Monetary deterioration is not subtle. In 1971, the United States closed the gold window. The dollar became pure fiat money. Since 2000, the money supply has grown by roughly 400%. Since 2020, more than $6 trillion has been created. Since 1971, the dollar has lost the overwhelming majority of its purchasing power. We are not diluting silver with copper. We are issuing paper without a metal anchor. The mechanism differs. The effect is the same. Debt dynamics look like a spiral. Federal liabilities stand near $36 trillion, about 120% of GDP. Annual interest costs are heading toward $1 trillion, competing with the defense budget. Even in a growing economy and in nominal peacetime, deficits persist, on the order of $1.8 trillion in 2024. Borrowing to pay interest on prior borrowing is the definition of a self-reinforcing problem. Spain defaulted 4 times. Britain borrowed until the structure broke. The Soviet system ran out of money others would accept. Our path matches theirs. The industrial base has eroded. The United States designs, finances, and consumes, but it manufactures far less than it used to. Production migrated to China, Mexico, Vietnam. The country imports roughly $800 billion more than it exports each year. Critical supply chains from medicines and electronics to steel and even parts for defense depend on foreign capacity. Spain turned into an importer while silver flowed out. We import while dollars flow out. When the flow that supports this arrangement weakens, the vulnerability becomes obvious. Social strain is visible. Confidence in institutions sits at historic lows. Crime worries cities across the map. Homelessness expands. Drug overdoses kill roughly 100,000 Americans annually. A share of the most capable opt out or move away. Birth rates decline. Political paralysis is constant. We cannot agree, cannot fix, cannot build. The symptoms are everywhere. Even as many pretend, the surface calm means safety. It does not. That puts us 5 steps into a 7-step sequence. The Soviet Union reached this point before it disintegrated. Britain did as well. Spain took longer, but the path was the same. We are not at the end, but we are far along. What comes next is the loss of reserve currency privilege. That phase begins when allies diversify, when trade settles in other units, and when dollars flood back to U.S. shores because fewer actors need to hold them. Early signs are present. Coalition groupings explore alternatives. Central banks increase gold holdings. China and Russia transact in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia accepts yuan for oil. Fissures are visible. The final phase is not a gentle taper, but a sudden break. The Soviet Union went from a superpower to a vanished state in roughly 900 days. Britain shed its empire in about 2 decades. Spain took longer to reach the same outcome. When the reserve currency weakens beyond repair, when the debt load becomes unmanageable, when the military posture cannot be funded, decline does not proceed politely. It snaps, and it hurts. Each time, those who insisted it could not happen here learned the same lesson. It can, and it does. 3 prior empires followed this line: Spain, Britain, the USSR. Each believed in its own uniqueness. Each claimed the rules would not apply. Each was wrong. We are comforting ourselves with the same claims now, that we are different, that technology changes the rules, that the dollar insulates us, that American exceptionalism will override arithmetic. But the sequence is indifferent to pride. The limits are mathematical. You cannot spend beyond capacity forever. You cannot maintain a global posture without a healthy, productive base. You cannot devalue money without eventual cost. And once the first 5 conditions are in place, the last 2 are not easily avoided. The only open variable is time, perhaps 10 years, perhaps 5, perhaps less. The pattern points to a break, and when it arrives, it will be quick. A currency shock that triggers a debt crisis that triggers a political storm. Overnight, a superpower becomes a cautionary tale. The reserve currency fades into a regional unit. The empire becomes a memory. The pattern carried the same verdict 3 times. It indicates we are next. Since 2020, we have accelerated every element in the chain, printed more money, added more debt, expanded commitments, hollowed production, and fractured society. We are no longer strolling along this route. We are running. If you recognize the pattern, the endpoint becomes visible. Maybe there is a way out. Maybe the United States can do what Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union could not: reform, rebuild, and restore. Maybe this time truly differs. The pattern argues otherwise. The arithmetic argues otherwise. And history, which has watched empires fail the same way again and again, suggests we are about to learn the lesson the hard way. If this clarified where we stand in the sequence, subscribe, because once those last two phases arrive, you will want to understand what happened and why. The answers are not hiding in the future. They were written in the past. I'll show you where to look.